What's up, hobby friends? In this video, I wanted to just do a quick review and comparison of the new Redgrass games wet palettes, looking at the new red Mark II versus the older orange and blue Mark Is. There's a couple of key differences I wanted to cover and sort of how they've improved the function and design of the new palette. And then I'll throw down a couple of quick tips and tricks to help you get the most out of your wet palette. Quickly looking at the working palette area of each of the wet palettes. The orange is about 19 centimeters across by 14 centimeters across. Of course, the sheets don't go all the way to the edge. On the red palette, it's about 23 centimeters across by, we'll call it 15 centimeters. And on the blue palette, we're looking at about 29 centimeters by 19 centimeters. So on the orange palette, we're looking at a total working space of about 266 centimeters squared. On the red palette, we're looking at a working space of about 345 centimeters squared, which is a 29.7% increase compared to the orange palette. And then on the blue palette, we're looking at about a working space of 551 centimeters squared, which is a 59.7% increase compared to the red wet palette, and a 107% increase in space compared to the orange palette. So you can see that the jump between orange and the red is a fairly moderate 30%, but then the jump to the blue is quite significant. Right? We're looking at double the size working space of the orange and almost 60% compared to the red. So I've been using the red palette for about a week now, and one of the most significant differences I've noticed is the improvement to the wet palette sponge. So they do give you a couple of extras when you actually pick up each palette. So these are the extras and these are unused. So dry, never been saturated. And immediately you can see that the width difference between the two, the new Mark II is quite a bit thicker than the older one. I would say probably about 25 to 30%. The newer Mark II one is also much softer and much more flexible, unused, whereas the older one is stiff. So it's obviously, it's been compressed and requires saturation to expand to full size. But in function, I've found that the newer one retains moisture much better than the older sheets. It doesn't evaporate quite as quickly, which means that over time, it allows more moisture to permeate into your wet palette sheet, whereas the older one evaporates pretty quickly and you're constantly having to resaturate the palette. It's a minor difference, but I found that the function of it makes a pretty big difference in both the working time of your individual sheets and your paints, and just lowering the frequency of saturation requirement. And of course, the most significant change that they've made between the Mark Is and the Mark IIs are the changes to their hydration membranes. These are essentially the actual palettes you're using. You're applying your paints and using them to paint your miniatures. The original Mark Is were essentially equivalent to your sort of unwaxed parchment sheets or baking sheets. They allowed moisture to permeate through from the actual sponge much more easily. So it was very easy to keep paints saturated on the older Mark Is. However, the downside is it also meant that the paint, I found, would also slowly stain through onto the sponge. And once the paint dried on the original Mark I sheets, you really couldn't reactivate them. Those sheets were very often one-shots. I would use them for one model and then throw them away. And just in terms of reusability, if I didn't seal it periodically every couple of hours to keep the paint moist, once the paint dried on it, that area of the sheet really just wasn't usable. With the new Mark IIs, it's a much more plasticky, waxed surface. It doesn't allow quite as much moisture to permeate through from the actual sponge itself. However, it does, because of its reusability, reactivate much more easily. So you're able to go back in once the paint is dried with some water, or just by sealing the palette up for a couple of hours. It does reactivate the paint and you're able to use it. So it's actually quite deceptive when they sell a pack. The original packs you would get, I think, 50 per sheet or 50 sheets per pack for whatever the price value of the pack was. I honestly don't remember. And because they're one shots, you got 50 uses out of them. If you call it maybe a couple of days per sheet, 50 sheets would last you quite a bit of time, but if you're painting quite often, you do go through a pack pretty quickly. The new sheets, you don't get quite as many in a pack. So for this one, you only get 15. And you may feel like you're getting less value out of each of these new Mark II sheets. However, when you think that each sheet can be reused between 6 to 10 times, one of these packs, if you're using it 6 times per sheet, actually gives you 90 uses. If you're using it even just 7 times, it's 105. So this is actually a much better value per pack. And you'll find that this goes a lot longer per sheet than the original Mark Is. So I want to quickly walk you through a couple of tips and tricks to really get the most out of your use of the wet palette. So the most important one is to always make sure that you keep your palette sponge moist and hydrated. Now, you don't want to constantly be getting up and going to your sink or whatever to constantly have to get water in there. So I do highly recommend investing in one of these squirt bottles. And the reason being is you just very quickly and easily on the go, squirt some water through, and it'll saturate quickly into the sponge. Now, depending on how quickly the water evaporates or how dry the air is in your painting area, you'll have to check periodically to make sure that the sponge itself is always wet and saturated. I like to keep a decent amount of water in the palette itself. You can see here that I make sure that the water goes all the way to the level of the sponge. I can see the water level on the corners of the palette. This is largely a personal preference for me, just so I don't have to constantly refill it. It takes quite a while, especially on the Mark IIs, for the water to evaporate. And then the air in my painting area is quite dry, so this allows me to keep my palette and my paints very wet and very moist while I am painting, which suits my painting style. The second is to properly store your wet palette with the right amount of moisture to save paint for your next painting session. So I've just finished a painting session for the day with my wet palette, and I want to make sure that I prepare it for storage. Regardless of how long, I usually store it for overnight and then come back to painting it the next day. So we're usually looking at between, on a weekday, probably at least 12 hours, but maybe 16 hours between sleep and then a full work day into the evening. If it's the weekend, probably 12 hours, so overnight, and then say around noon the next day. It is currently a little past midnight. So we want to make sure that we have just the right amount of moisture in the wet palette. Too much, and the moisture will end up seeping through the paper and evaporating into the lid of your moisture and dripping down onto your paints. And what it'll end up doing is turning all of your paint into just giant puddles of pigment. It pulls everywhere, mixes, and creates a giant mess. If you don't have enough moisture, it ends up not really preserving the paints, and it continues to dry even if you seal this palette as tight as you can. So I found that the right amount of moisture is enough to saturate the sponge without any water collecting when you tilt it. So what we're going to do is here, any sort of excess moisture, I'm just going to collect on the edge and pour out. And I think that'll be good and sufficient. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to seal this lid. Compress all the edges and all the corners, make sure it's nice and closed. And then we'll come back to it tomorrow, probably around 11 or 12, so noontime. And then I'll show you what it looks like when it's been properly sealed and with just the right amount of moisture. Thanks to the magic of editing, we've now passed about 12 hours. So we're looking at about noon on the next day. So we're just going to open up this palette right now, and we're going to take a look at the status of the paints inside. You can see that it's relatively unchanged from last night. The paints are still wet. You can see that they're still glistening. And there's no moisture on the top of our lid. So nothing has evaporated. It hasn't dropped down and changed the consistency of the paint. This is pretty much how I left the paint last night. And you can see that as I'm moving some of the paints around. It's very workable. All right, so that's pretty much the perfect level of moisture. We want to have just enough water in the palette so that a couple of drops may pool, but basically nothing collects. All the moisture is in the sponge. And then with the combination of the airtight seal, keeps our paints nice and fresh and workable for quite a long time. So they advertise the new sheets as being able to be reused between 6 to 10 times. Redgrass did send me the new Mark II sheets quite a few months ago, and I've been using them on the blue Mark I palette for quite a bit. And I found that pushing the reuse to about 9 or 10 times does degrade the quality of the actual membrane itself. I find 6 or 7 is the magic number. Because the paints over time and overuse do stain the sheet, as you're washing, it does tend to wear down the surface material and the wax of the paper. Once you start hitting that 7, 8, and then reaching into 9 or 10 times, the sheet just doesn't hold the paint quite as well. Moisture doesn't permeate quite through, and the paints aren't quite as workable on the surface as opposed to a fresh new sheet. So I do recommend that you look at it as 6 or 7 times for reuse, and I would recommend keeping track of your reuses somehow. You're going to find that you're using, depending on how often you paint, one sheet will last you at least a couple of weeks, especially if you're painting every day and you're, let's say, rewashing it every 2 or 3 days. It can be easy to forget what reuse you're on, so I recommend keeping like a post-it note or whatever thing. You can just pin it to the bottom or the top of your wet palette sheet. Every time you reuse it, keep a tick. Once you hit 6 or 7, you can just toss the sheet and then start anew. You can see on my palette as well the quantity of paint I'm using, and I think this is one of the bigger differences between the Mark Is and the Mark IIs. On the Mark Is, because moisture permeated the membrane much more easily, you could have a larger amount of paint and work in sort of a larger space with a larger quantity without any real issue, with the exception, of course, that on the Mark Is, once it dried, you couldn't reuse that area. So on the Mark IIs, however, because moisture doesn't permeate as easily, if you have a thick glob of paint on the palette, you're going to find that it really only keeps the bottom of the little glob moist, and then the top will dry out from air over time because it's not getting enough moisture from the palette. Once it dries, it's also much harder to reactivate. You don't want to be trying to use your brush to spread around this big glob of dried paint. You're going to waste a lot from drying on the surface, and then when you push it down, it's just going to eat up a lot of space. What I like to do on the new Mark IIs, just put a little drop of paint, spread it around so that it's a very thin layer, and then even when it dries, using a bit of moisture to reactivate it, you can reactivate the entire area and not waste any paint. Additionally, with small quantities of paint like this, you'll find that even with moisture saturating through the membrane itself, the paints will dry out over time, and when they're like these little dots of color that don't really activate well, something you can do during a painting session, saturate your palette. Make sure it's nice and wet. The water level is up to the top of the sponge. And then you seal it for about 20 to 30 minutes. If you're painting for a long session, call it a couple of hours, maybe every hour or two, it can be great to take a break. Seal it for 20 or 30 minutes, go get a snack, bathroom break, stretch your legs, arms, shoulders, whatever. And then when you come back, some of that moisture will have evaporated and reactivated your paints so that they're nice and wet again without having to wait overnight. And then finally, the last trick, if you ever read through the instructions for the new Mark II sheets, they do recommend that you rewash or you wash these reusable sheets when they're wet and not when they're dry. So you're going to want to either saturate the palette and then seal it for a couple of hours, or keep the sponge moist enough that you can seal it overnight for about 9 or 10 hours so that all of the paint is wet and watery. Pop it open and give the entire sheet a quick rinse. That way you can wash off the majority of the paint without having to scrub and push around your finger or an old brush on the palette surface. I have found that when the paints are dry, it takes quite a longer time to actually scrub through all the dry paints underwater. And this scrubbing can put some wear and tear on the top of the sheet. If you scrub too hard or put too much pressure, it can add folds and creases, which sort of hampers your ability to reuse the sheet as effectively. So I do recommend washing the membrane when wet and not dry. That's pretty much it. I've been using these palettes for a number of years, the Mark Is, since they first came out a couple of years ago, and then the Mark II I picked up about a week ago when it came out, and I've been using it ever since. I'm probably not going to go back to the orange Mk1, although I will periodically use the blue one when I'm working on a larger project that requires many more paints, but the red one's going to be my go-to. If you only had to own one of these palettes, I'd probably go with the blue one, and it's just a matter of flexibility and options. It's one of those situations where you'd rather have the space and not need it than need the space and not have it. If you have the luxury of owning 2 or more of them, then you can consider picking up the red one. Its size is still functionally great, especially when you're working on single model projects or on army where your color palette is rather limited, so around 10 or 11 colors. And having both allows you to switch between 2 different projects simultaneously if you're that kind of a multitasker. I do find that the orange one is a little too small for the way I work. It doesn't have enough room for even a limited color palette for armies. And with the release of the red palette, I think the orange one can probably be phased out, and you really only need these 2, the blue and the red. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, make sure you give it a like and follow for more awesome weekly content. And if you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll make sure to have links in the video description below. As always, until next time, happy hobbying.